Hello, my name is Jim. This is my podcast, The Bloody Vegans. You're very welcome to it. Each week, I'll be travelling ever deeper into the world of veganism, discovering along the way a multitude of viewpoints from the political and ethical to the practical. I'll be doing this through a series of conversations, each aiming to further illuminate my understanding and hopefully yours of all things plant-centric. And this week is no different. This week is episode 50 of the Bloody Vegans podcast. We are rapidly approaching a year. Unbelievable, isn't it? This week, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Katie, the founder of Veganly Katie. Katie is a Seattle-based writer and recipe developer who has a huge passion for developing recipes and sharing everything she's learned in the world of plant-based cooking, as well as some aspects of her personal vegan journey. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Katie from veganlykatie.com. It would be really good to get started with a little bit of your journey into the world of veganism. What's kind of brought you here and to this point?
Well, for a little bit of background, I grew up just eating, a standard American diet, maybe a little healthier. We didn't eat a ton of meat in my home, but we didn't avoid it. We weren't vegetarian or vegan by any means. But really, the concepts of even vegetarian didn't enter my life at all until my twin sister. She was about 12 years old and she decided to go vegetarian just for the health benefits. And she read an article comparing like red meat to smoking. And so just kind of right there, like cold turkey, she just gave it up. And it wasn't really an animal rights decision or environment or anything. So it wasn't really something that affected me in any way until she was about 14 and she went vegan. She was doing a lot of research, and it was the first time we had ever heard, like my entire family really, about anyone going vegan. We didn't know any other vegans, and especially this young, at like age 14. And so a couple months after that, she started to not only implement like plant-based foods into her diet, but she actually started to take on veganism as the lifestyle and buying like toiletries that were vegan and cruelty-free and throwing away her wool clothes or her leather shoes and things like that. And it was just so really empowering to me, like, and really inspiring. I was like, why would she give all of this up just for like the animals? Like, it wasn't really a big deal for me. I was like, well, everyone's eating animals. Like, I've always eaten like meat. It's like not a big deal. I've always worn like wool and stuff. But seeing someone really in my life who was making these big changes, and she would always kind of tell me about like kind of just little small things that she had researched about maybe the animal agriculture industry or the like factory farming industry. And it was just really something that I kind of blocked out. I was like, okay, like you might want to be changing your whole life and getting rid of all of your clothes that are like wool and whatnot. But I was like, okay, like I'm not gonna like listen to that because I don't want that to like be that kind of like imposition that it seemed like it was, even though she was like more than willing. She was like, no, like I'm happy to do this. But it just seemed like something I didn't really want to have to go through, like figuring out what am I eating, like what are my everything that I'm using, what is it made out of. But she would try and convince me like a little bit sometimes. If I was eating meat, she would be like, oh Katie, like don't you want to eat this like veggie burger instead or whatever. And so one day I made a deal with her and I said, okay, like I'll try to be vegan for a week just for you because you've been doing this for like 6 months, you really love it, like I'll try it, see what it kind of is about. And really that first day, it was something that just really resonated with me. I just loved it from the very first day. And that is just completely true. I was just like about to go downstairs, get breakfast, get like a yogurt, like my standard breakfast. And I had to have my sister tell me, like, no, Katie, that has dairy in it. Like, I didn't even think about what I was eating. It was just kind of like to really think about, okay, like, and focus on, like, okay, this is not vegan, this has everything in it. And you start realizing what really is in your food. And then you start really becoming more aware of those choices, even just because in this week, I was just eating like plant based. I wasn't making those other switches like shampoos and conditioners, like cruelty free and whatnot. It was just more me becoming aware for the first time of like the foods that I was eating and really being forced to look at labels to make sure I was complying with like what a vegan really does eat. And it was just really empowering for me. I was like, I never knew I was eating all of these things that are in the labels that I never had any reason to read before. And that was just really something I was like, yeah, I want to know what I'm putting into my body. Like, I want to know. And then I was like, okay, I also want to know where this comes from, like how it really gets into the food that I'm eating, like what my sister is so like focused on trying to like combat by being vegan. And so I started doing a little research with my sister. Like, she helped guide me through the research I was doing and recommend websites and everything. And I started to really realize how like inhumane the treatment of animals was, how it got into your food. And it was just really something I just couldn't take at the time before I had decided to go vegan. Like, when my sister was telling me, like, oh, this is like, wouldn't you rather eat this veggie burger? Like, it's so much more nice than like killing an animal. And I just wouldn't listen to that until I knew, because I kind of knew that I would feel guilty. I was this like big animal lover at the time as well. And I knew I would feel guilty if I really looked into it and was like, okay, she's right. Like, I am hurting this animal, even though it's so obvious and I kind of knew it. I wasn't ready until I decided, okay, like, I'll try being vegan. And I started really liking it, that I was like, okay, I'm ready to like figure out the next steps, like what really goes on, like behind the scenes, kind of.
What was the the particular kind of the real hook for you from a research point of view? Now, when you started to do that research with your sister, was there a particular thing, a source, perhaps the health, the animal welfare side of things, the environment? Was there something that you can recall really resonated with you, whether it be a documentary or a source of information of some kind of other kind?
You know, that is a really good question, because I thought that it was all about animals at that point. My sister, she was like, "Oh, you don't want to like kill this animal. You love animals, all of this." And that, I guess, when she was telling me that, and then I started researching, that wasn't even what really resonated with me at first. Of course, now I'm like animal rights vegan, environmental vegan, like all of it, but the first thing that I really like came across on this research was all of the environmental benefits, and that is kind of what kept me going, like realizing how much carbon dioxide, like, and methane or whatever is produced like with the dairy industry, and how many resources it takes to raise all of this livestock that is like completely unnecessary. And that climate change, it was like almost every day I feel like there was an article about climate change getting worse, because I went vegan maybe a year and a half ago. And so climate change has really sped up since then. And that was something that I could really relate to in my life. I mean, it was something that was in the newspapers every day that I could say, okay, I'm like not contributing to this cause, like I'm helping, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and particularly like, as we talked about before, we kind of hit record. Where you're based in the Washington area, you're directly feeling, I guess, the effects of climate change right now with the kind of the smoke and the fallout, if you like, from the fires, and from that perspective, is that kind of, I guess that's probably galvanized where your thinking's at from an environmental standpoint. Have you, maybe within the contact you've had with, friends and family and so on, perhaps those in your circle that you've been trying to maybe persuade who aren't quite there yet. Has the kind of very real consequences of climate change kind of coming very close to home? Do you think that's resonated at all with those people who are perhaps still on the fence, or perhaps working towards but haven't really made the connection? Are you seeing that with your friends and family?
I am actually. My family, we've become, since me and my sister went vegan, my family has tried to really become, especially for me, a lot more like environmentally friendly. And seeing all of this in the news about the fire, seeing it in our real lives, like not being able to leave our houses because of the smoke, and talking to friends about it, and they're like, "Oh, I just wish it would be over." And I'm like, "Well, you can kind of help that cause by just maybe like reducing your carbon or eating more plant foods." And they're like, "Yeah, like I don't see how that would help." And then you can tell them to research it. You can tell them some kind of statistics about how much of an environmental benefit it is to eat more plant-based foods. And my parents especially, they really know that. They're thinking like now, like, why can't more people be vegan? I'm like so proud of you two for being vegan, because look at the world out there and no one really is caring about it. um, but especially with friends, it's really something that I see some changes. Like one of my close friends, she's like, "Yeah, Katie, I thought about you the other day, and I told my mom like not to drive me to the store, like that I was gonna walk so we could save some carbon dioxide like into the air and things like that." So I feel like just slowly it has kind of an impact, and especially when you see it in your real life, people just really get shocked. They're like, "Wow, I didn't expect the consequences like this. We really do need to do something."
Well, I guess that's encouraging to hear. I guess the challenge is how, at what kind of pace, and the volume of people that are prepared to make that change, and how quickly they are prepared to do it, I suppose, is the big challenge for us. I'd just like to pick up on a point. You talk about that kind of standard American diet, and I'm interested in your perspective. As someone living over in the States who's grown up with that standard American diet, how kind of ingrained have you felt that sort of sense of what good nutrition is? How ingrained do you feel it is in sort of the society, the community in which you live? And have you found it kind of almost a bit unshakable when you've challenged people around veganism, or perhaps you've started to talk to them about veganism? Do you find that they are quite resistant because their knowledge is so rooted in that standard American diet?
I really do, actually, and especially even for myself, when my sister would try and tell me, like, I would be like, "No, I've always grown up eating this food. There can't be anything wrong with it. Like, I've never heard of any of that before." Because veganism has really grown, and it's kind of still a new thing, especially just in Seattle. It's kind of a progressive area. There are a lot of vegans, but I live a little bit outside of Seattle, and it's more of just like a calmer city. There's a lot less vegans, and I really don't know anyone else who is a vegan. And I think that just everybody that I know, they're always eating like meats or cheese sandwiches or everything at lunch. And they're always like, "What are you eating? Like, I've never seen like that tofu or whatever." They're like, "Oh, that looks gross," or anything like that, because it's not something that is really part of what they've grown up with eating, and what their families say, like, "Oh, like drink your milk and your bones are strong," and all that. I've heard that my entire life, and my parents would say that to me when I was younger, and that just really sticks with you. You're like, dairy can't be bad. It's like something that everyone knows, it's so good for your like bones and everything. um because especially at a young age, things like that really stick. And so it's really hard to wrap your mind around the fact that maybe that's not really the best. And so that's why, especially for me, I was like, there's no way that everything I've been hearing my whole childhood, like meat has protein and iron and everything, to find out that maybe there's a lot of negative consequences with eating that as well.
Yeah, totally. On that note, when you talk about like your parents kind of being super proud, and rightly so, of yourself and your sister for making this move, particularly from an environmental standpoint, was there any concerns that you had to address with them around, your health, yours and your sister's health? Did you have to kind of almost show them the research, or by that point did your sister kind of pave the way?
Well, a little bit of both actually. When my sister, she went vegan, my parents, they were really concerned because again, the whole standard American diet with like meats and like cheeses and dairy and everything being like the kind of healthy like standard for everybody where I live. My parents were like, if you don't eat enough dairy, you're not gonna be healthy. If you don't eat enough like meat with all this protein, where are you gonna get your protein? And especially being so young, they were kind of like, you're still developing, you're still growing. Like, I don't know if this is the healthiest idea. And especially because it was so new in our family and to my parents, they didn't know anyone who was vegan, let alone now having kids who wanted to go vegan. And so they were really concerned about it and they really pushed against it. And my sister, I'm really grateful that she, like you said, she did pave the way because she kind of had to fight um, for the cause. And she would show my parents some research, or like, she would tell them like why she was really doing it for the animals because of the treatment that they go through, and that we love animals in my family. And my mom was like, yeah, I understand that, but maybe you're just reading too much into this, and that's not what happens. I've never heard that. And because so many people, they just like to think that it's like these farms that's just all cute and happy, and that's just kind of what I thought too. And so there's just a lot of research you have to show people to convince them, and there's a lot of work you have to put in, especially in a family where my mom and dad still aren't vegan or vegetarian. um, and so having to convince them enough to the fact that then my mom, she's really big on having family dinners, so she would have to start cooking vegan family dinners. And so it would really take a lot to convince her to let us go vegan, let alone then have to have her start learning how to cook vegan foods. And so it was really, really a struggle. And my sister had to fight like every night at dinner, like, can we please make this without cheese or anything, so that it would really start becoming part of like what we would start eating. And now we eat vegan every night, but it really took a lot of work. And my mom also, I mean, she kind of thought of it as something that wouldn't last, especially for me. I was kind of big on like everything, like people were doing all of these like fad diets or whatever it is, like in like high schools and everything, and you're like, oh yeah, I want to do that, and it lasts like a week. And my mom was like, yeah, I don't want to have to make all these changes just to have you girls like go back in the next week. And that's not what veganism is about. And we really had to show her and really prove to her that it was something long term, for more than just like, oh, I want to like do this for my health, or for my, well, it is for health, but not just like, oh, I want to like lose weight from it or anything like that. It has to be something that you can really sustain because you're helping people other than yourself, and it's for a bigger cause. So that took a lot of convincing, but it's really worth it.
It's pretty impressive that you got to a point where you're eating vegan as a family, like, every night. That's pretty amazing. Do you think that was kind of a bit of the inspiration for you setting up the website, Veganly Katie, and starting to develop recipes? Was that kind of almost wanting to be able to show the family what great vegan food could look like?
Hmm. That is definitely part of it. I mean, I've always loved to like cook and bake, but it was always, of course, with like recipes and everything. And I had never thought about making my own recipes. Um, but going vegan, there's definitely a lot less options. Like, there's tons of vegan like websites and everything out there, but there's less like options. Like, no, there are definitely a lot less resources out there for vegan cooking, vegan baking. There's tons, but it's a lot harder to find like your perfect recipe the when veganism is so new. And so creating your own recipes really gives you that like control to make them however you want and make sure they are perfect. And then having your family members try them who aren't vegan and loving them. And that's just so empowering to me, that I could create something that to me is my perfect like dessert or meal that I've made exactly how I want it to taste, and I know it's going to be exactly how I want it to be because I've created all of it. And then to give it to someone who's not vegan and they're like, this is so good, like, is this even vegan? Like friends and stuff, I have my friends try my recipes obviously before I put them up on my website, or I have my friends make them. And I had a friend the other day, she was like, Katie, this is so good. My mom loves it too. Like, she's thinking of going vegan, and this is just really like, she was kind of worried she wouldn't be able to find vegan dessert she loves. She'd be able to taste the difference, but she really loves it. Like, thank you. And then I just feel so good about that, that I am helping to kind of people who are in the middle, like, oh, I kind of want to go vegan. And then this food, they're like, okay, I can still eat food like this as a vegan. Like, I'll do it, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. And I suppose one of the benefits of not having a whole bunch of friends and family who are yet converted means you've got a captive audience of folks who you can test these recipes on and hopefully persuade. And I suppose spreading that message out even further through the website is an excellent thing to do. So more power to you. When I think about creating recipes from scratch, certainly from my very limited experience, and I can't confess to be anywhere near as talented as yourself when it comes to cooking. Um, the leap between doing a recipe, following a recipe that I've seen, online or in a cookbook or whatever, and then even thinking about creating a recipe feels like a fairly vast gap for me. How did you begin to create recipes? Was it a case of, taking something non-vegan and trying to veganize it, or what was the inspiration, and were there some influences around, whether it be other vegan chefs or even non-vegan chefs that kind of helped you along that path of what does recipe development actually look like?
Well, it actually really started very, very small. A couple, maybe last year, I would say, when I would just have this phase where I loved chocolate chip cookies, and I just got home from school and I just wanted to make some cookies, but I didn't want to spend the time to actually look up a recipe, follow a recipe. So I would just kind of throw some stuff together, and it was really fun, and it didn't always work out at all, but sometimes it turned out really well. And it's just something that I made a lot as a vegan and even not as a vegan. And so I kind of was familiar with the ingredients. And so the measurements, I would just kind of eyeball and just make it. And it was really fun, even when it didn't turn out well, just to be kind of creating and making something that was completely my own, and just like tweaking that recipe until I had one that I liked, that I could just kind of just something that I could just throw together like after school one day without spending a lot of time following like instructions and reading these like recipe ratings to find the one that's been like rated the best. Which one do I want to try? And I could add whatever I want to it and just kind of adjust it. And I never did much with those though. I just made like this one chocolate chip cookie recipe, and I didn't really write it down. I just kind of memorized the ingredients and everything, and I made it a lot. But it wasn't until this COVID quarantine that I got really bored, and I started just kind of developing my own recipes. And I kind of at the beginning, I kind of was like, okay, if I can make enough recipes in all of this free time that I have, then I could make a cookbook or I could make a blog. And that, of course, is what ended up happening. But I wanted to be a little bit more like original. My first recipe, aside from just those standard chocolate chip cookies, which I didn't put on my blog because those were kind of before I actually did more research and before I kind of learned more techniques and everything. But my first recipe was these ginger snap, like chocolate chip ginger snap cookies. And I wanted to do things like that because there are a lot of just plain vegan chocolate chip cookie recipes, but I wanted to do some things that were a little more unique, where maybe I would be one of the few people with that type of recipe, like a ginger chocolate chip cookie I had never heard of, but it sounded good to me. And it worked out super, super well. And that is just kind of, I just continued like every day basically, for the next couple weeks and into summer, I would just be recipe developing, and it was just really fun, and it just became like a really fun hobby. And then I had to learn how to take the pictures and everything, but that's basically how it all went down.
So kind of the necessity of boredom, if you like, or kind of giving that creative spark is pretty amazing, because the amount of recipes that you managed to produce, if it was all in that period, is pretty amazing. There's some phenomenal recipes in there. I want to just pick up on a point that is apparent to me going through the recipes, that you've got a real balance of sort of almost what you'd consider kind of treat food in a way, with some super healthy dishes. And then even when you've got things that are, typically would be considered a treat, you've made oil-free versions or sugar-free versions. There's even some nut-free versions, and different variations. And I just wondered if that was something that was super important to you, the kind of health conscious side of things, and trying to remove as much of the kind of whether it be the oil or the sugar. Was that a conscious decision, or was it just the way the recipes ended up through trial and error? They just tasted better that way. What was there an initial objective in that?
Well, there were a couple reasons behind it. One of which was that when I was first learning about all of the environmental benefits of going vegan, I saw a lot of things about maybe like palm oil being so bad and like destructive to rainforests and whatnot. And then cane sugar is also just really like grown so rapidly. It's really just takes up a lot of space for other like plants and everything. So like the plantations are really resource, like they take a lot of resources. And so I had like a phase where I tried to be like completely oil free, and coconut oil is not super great for the environment either. But I had a phase where I would try to be oil free and sugar free, and it's really hard. So I kind of do it as much as I can right now, but a lot of my recipes just don't work as well without those things. But that's kind of the inspiration. Part of the inspiration for that is that it is, like you said, a lot more environmentally friendly to avoid oil and avoid refined sugar. But also for those vegans who do it only for health, I still want to have some recipes out there that can kind of cater to everybody's like needs, if that makes sense, because the people doing it for health probably aren't going to go vegan to eat like vegan cookies that are just like tons of like butter and sugar and everything. So if they're like a little on the healthier side, that kind of works well for everybody because they're still delicious and they also have like these benefits of no oil, no refined sugar. And then just the fact that if you can avoid it, like if you can take it out, it's just overall healthier, and it makes them like, for my muffins especially, having applesauce instead of oil, it just makes them more fluffy and light. And I just kind of like to try and make my foods as healthy as I can, if it works well for the recipe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, why not? Like you say, there are a lot of people, particularly I think at the moment, who perhaps start on their vegan journey, perhaps as plant-based folks, looking to be a little healthier. We think about game changers and so on. There's been some sort of seismic shifts, or at least it feels like there has been in terms of the growth of veganism through things like that. But I say veganism, but they usually come to it from a plant-based angle and that health angle, and I suppose giving them some really good options might hopefully make them start to have the time in the plant-based space to research the rest of it, and take the leap into full-on veganism. So yeah, more power to you for that, I say. From the perspective of like the recipe development, was there one that was a particular favorite that you've been particularly proud of? Maybe one that was a real challenge for you to create?
Well, I have these soft pretzels that I just put on my website, and they were something that I thought would be really difficult to make, and I had to do a lot of research because I hadn't actually worked with yeast. I usually use like a self-rising flour, but these needed yeast and it had to rise and everything. And so I had to do a lot of research on those. And my sister, she really did like them. I had one of her friends come over to taste it as well. And she did like them, and my mom liked them, but I had to do some recipe edits just to make sure they could cater to everybody because that's kind of my goal. My sister, she is not super like hard to please in terms of the things that I make, but because she really didn't like them, it kind of took a little bit of time and I needed to get all the feedback and really compile it and see what kind of changes I needed to make sure that they would be perfect for anybody and that they could really like suit anybody's taste. But especially also just having to create that whole recipe, it's probably my most complicated and like the most steps because it's kind of a complicated recipe, but it's still so easy. It just kind of takes a while. And I mean, it was worth it. It was worth putting in the time, figuring out how to edit it, how to fix it to make sure that it could really suit everybody.
They look amazing, and sounds like you've got a pretty valuable resource in your sister there in terms of as a critic. Has your sister been perhaps one of your harshest critics? Is she a bit of a barometer for you of, especially as she kind of helped you on your vegan journey? Is she a bit of a barometer for you in terms of whether a recipe really has landed well?
I mean, it depends. I have the whole family taste every recipe, and then I either send it home with some of my friends. I have them come pick it up, or they come over and try it, or I just send them the recipe and I have like friends make it to make sure there's no kinks in the recipe and that it turns out well reading my like directions. But my sister is not one of the harder critics for most of my recipes. Some of them she really, really hates, and she's very she really voices that. But a lot of them she loves like on the first batch, but then maybe some of my other family members might not like it, like my dad or my mom or anything. So I just have to make sure that everybody can love it, especially since my mom and dad aren't vegan. I really have to take their criticisms kind of a lot more to heart, if that makes sense. But my sister, she's quite harsh on the ones that she doesn't like. And then I know that they're bad and that I need to do some serious editing and recipe testing on them because a lot of them she really does like. So
You mentioned there, you know, making sure that they're right for your parents who have, you know, perhaps got a more omnivorous sort of palate. Has that been, you know, an important factor in your recipe development in terms of appealing to folks who aren't yet vegan? Is that a real mission for you with the website and the sort of the recipe creation?
yeah, definitely. It's especially harder for me to know what more vegans are thinking about my recipes until I actually publish them because my family, aside from my sister, are all omnivores, and then my friends, I don't have any vegan friends actually, and so those are all the people who are testing my recipes. And so it really, they do kind of cater more to an omnivorous palate, which I think is good because if someone who's used to eating these animal products in their like cookies, then they like a vegan cookie, that's kind of more validation than a vegan being like, oh yeah, this is a good vegan cookie versus an omnivore being like, this is a good cookie, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and yeah, it's an interesting one because I think, you know, when I look through your recipes, what really strikes me is that they're often, you know, pretty kind of whole foods in their origin, you know, whole food, plant based, good nutrition. If I think about something like, you know, a black bean carrot burger, which is one of your pretty awesome recipes, or, you know, the walnut pinto bean burgers, you know, I'll take those and I compare them with, you know, where perhaps mainstream sort of veganism, certainly commercial veganism, is going, which is the kind of meat substitute route. And you've gone down this kind of like quite whole foods, hearty, healthy, nutritious, but with a kind of appeal, like you say, to the omnivorous palate. Hello, Siri's talking to me at the same time. Um, do, 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 Is that quite conscious with you, like that side of things about making something appeal but be healthy? And where do you stand on the kind of the meat substitute route? Is it something that you've embraced as a vegan for a couple of years now? And how do they land with your family? It'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
Well, that is a very good question. So I have thoughts on both parts of the question. So first of all, that really is something that I'm really conscious about, making sure that my recipes are accessible to anybody, because I know the meat substitutes are definitely not cheap, and so I don't want to use, I mean, tofu, that I guess you could consider that a meat substitute, and I have a couple tofu dishes, but all three of the burgers on my site, they are have the protein source of nuts sometimes, and then obviously mainly beans, because beans are a pretty cheap source of protein and they work really well to like hold together in a burger, and it makes it really like easy to grill and everything. I just really like to kind of avoid using more of expensive ingredients like meat substitutes, and try and stick with more, like you said, whole foods, because a lot of times those are cheaper and it's healthier, of course. Because I've had like one of those impossible burgers before, and to be honest, I'm not really a fan, and I also know that they're not great for you because they have a lot of I believe it's like soy protein isolate in them, and that's not very like good for your body, or like a natural whole food ingredient. And they also take a lot of resources to create, which is not very environmentally friendly, so I definitely try and stay away from those products. And beans are just really good, a really good natural whole food source. And my pasta, even, I have like a really protein rich pasta on my site, and it's made with like cannellini beans that I just blend up into the sauce for like this like subtle kind of like protein, if that makes sense. But I definitely don't use meat substitutes very much, even when I'm not on my blog. Just at home, we don't really use those type of like Beyond Meat or like Tofurkey or anything like that, because it's just not good for you. It's not good for the environment, and it's definitely not a very cost-effective choice.
No, that the cost effective bit is really interesting. Have you found a lot of folks who, like you say, your world outside of your sister has been, from as you described, quite an omnivorous one in terms of the points of contact you have, friends, family, etc. Is one of the kind of criticisms that you've kind of heard from them being price? It's often the one that's given to vegans, and I suppose it sounds like you've really looked to combat that with your recipes. Is that one that you've heard a lot? Is the kind of, it's too expensive to be vegan?
I definitely hear that all the time when people like, I don't tell people, just like random people, like, oh hey, I'm vegan, but if like it comes up or anything, they're like, oh yeah, I really wish I could be vegan, and then one of two things, it's like it's just too expensive, like my, and then the second is just my family is not like gonna transition with me, so I'd have to be like cooking my own food. I would have to be like ordering separate things from the grocery store and getting all these vegan substitutes that my family wouldn't eat. I'd be the only one eating all of this stuff. And that is definitely part of the issue, is that if you're buying all these meat substitutes, that people who are not vegan really have a hard time with those. Especially, I know I did. I wouldn't touch like a meat substitute before when there was an option to eat meat. But something like beans, that's something that we've had in my house forever, like before anyone was vegan. And I'm sure most people have some type of can of beans, which is just like a source of protein that's not specific to vegans, that anybody could eat. You can make a black bean soup and your whole family would be familiar with that. That would be something you might eat in a family with no vegans. And that's cheap, because I definitely hear that a lot, that the vegan diet is just too expensive, buying all of these like vegan substitutes, vegan butters and everything. And I know that can definitely be an issue, which is why I also try and incorporate more coconut oil recipes. I have a couple backed up, and I have one that's on my site. Um, And it works out really well because coconut oil is definitely cheaper than a vegan butter. And having to find the right kind of vegan butter, I know when my parents go to the store, they take us with them. They're like, I'm not going to search through all the aisles to make sure, look at all the labels to make sure it's vegan. So it seems kind of like it could be an inconvenience in some families, but it's really not if you pick the right foods and you know what really like what kind of things that you're looking for when it's not having to check all the labels. It's just something standard like beans or like rice or lentils or any source of protein that's not something that you have never heard of and that you have to make sure it's vegan. It's just something standard that's in everybody's pantry, really.
Talking of that, what's kind of in everybody's pantry and what's available, and as somebody who's kind of gone on this journey, figured out so many incredible recipes. Is there kind of a set of whether it's a go-to recipe or some go-to ingredients that you'd recommend anyone who's thinking about moving into a plant-based diet and then ultimately kind of a full vegan lifestyle? What would be the recommended ingredients, or perhaps there's a recipe or two that you'd point to on your site that you would say is a great kind of starter?
Well, a couple of the ones I was talking about, the my peanut butter oatmeal chocolate chip cookies, the only thing that is really quote vegan about them is the chocolate chips, and you could use just a dark chocolate bar because depending on like the percent of cacao, like usually those don't have milk in them, so they're fine. Or you could just skip the chocolate chips and you use applesauce instead of oil, or you can use flax seeds, which a lot of people have anyway just for smoothies and things. It's not a specifically vegan ingredient. And those are the cookies that I actually had my one of my friends, the one whose mom was like, yeah, these are great. Like I had her use those because she was like, oh yeah, like I'll definitely recipe like test one of your recipes, but I don't like want to go to the store and buy all of these things. So I suggested that recipe to her and she was like, yeah, I have all of those things except the chocolate chips. So she went and bought them. But just having like coconut oil and applesauce, those are really good, and oil and an egg substitute. Um, because they do have like egg replacers. But those are, again, those are like an expensive vegan substitute when you could use then flax eggs, or like a flax egg with like flax meal, or a chia egg with chia seeds. And then just obviously having beans to make burgers or just to make soups or anything, lentil soup, using like rice, that's a really good staple. Also, just like a lot of breads. I mean, just for anyone's pantry, breads, nuts, like nut butters, all of that. Those are things that like we've had in our pantry. We've like eaten like our whole lives, even before anyone went vegan, and they just happen to be vegan. And things like lentils or beans or quinoa, it's all very like protein rich, and so you're fine and on like that front. And so those are some of the things that I would recommend. And then all of my burgers, they just have beans, and then my walnut pinto bean burgers have walnut. So like super protein rich, all of my burgers, and none of them have anything like meat substitutes or specific vegan like products. And actually, my walnut pinto bean burger has just mostly dried spices, which are also cheap, and then it just has like some soy sauce, which is really good to flavor of like a large variety of foods. So those are just some of my recipes that are really like pantry friendly, and then just some other pantry friendly items, bananas, fruits, everything like that.
Katie, that's awesome. It's been excellent chatting with you. I've loved it, and learnt lots through your website. The recipes are truly amazing. Like I say, I'm nowhere near the standard of cook that you are, obviously, but certainly some of the burger recipes, particularly, have become firm favourites in my household. So, a huge thank you for your time. It's been great chatting to you.